Masterclass. So this is not going to teach you every little thing about CSS, but it's going to give you a strong foundation in which to build from in CSS. So if you haven't already watched it, I do recommend that you watch my Intro to HTML Masterclass video before this video, where I discuss kind of like the setup and like what does an HTML file look like and how do you connect an HTML file to a CSS file and all of that. Okay, so this is an HTML file. I connected it to a CSS file with this link tag, and that's what matters. So basically I have an index.html file. That's where I can put content, and then my style.css is where I'm going to define how it looks like. So let's just start simple. Let's create an h1 and say hello world. Okay, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to use live server, which is an extension on VS Code. So if I right click on the index.html, I can open with live server and open this up in the browser. So you see the hello world. I'll put this off to the side so we can see these things side by side. Okay, cool. And then let's go to our style.css. So CSS stands for cascading style sheets. What this is, it's sort of a very, it's not a general purpose language. It's a language specifically for describing the styling of markup in a web page. In the same way that HTML is more a specific language, not a general purpose language for describing the structure of content on a web page. So HTML describes the structure, that there's an h1 that has the text hello world, and with CSS we can describe sort of the appearance of that. And the way you do that is you have to select an HTML element. So I need to somehow select this h1. And the way you do that is with what's called a Css Selector. And there's several of them. That's going to be sort of like the main thing we need to learn. The simplest selector is you choose the tag name itself, so h1. Okay, so if I do h1 and then do curly brackets like this, this is a style. I've selected h1 elements, and anything that applies to that selector will have these styles applied. Simplest thing we can do is do a color style, which is just the font color. And we'll just make the font blue, and then we use a semicolon to end that particular style. And we can see that the hello world has become blue. Okay, because this style has applied to it. Now, the one issue with choosing the tag is this. If I create many h1s, all of them will be blue. But let's say I want this one to not be blue. Then selecting the h1 won't work. Okay. So maybe I want to be more specific. Okay, and that's the thing about CSS. It's all about being specific. Actually, every selector has points. So if I go back to my CSS file, in VS Code, it should be able to tell you the points of the selector. So if I hover over the selector, see it says Selector Specificity. And I got the lowest score possible, which is 1. Think of this first tier as 1 point. There are 1 point selectors, 10 point selectors, and there are 100 point selectors. And we'll break that on as we go through. Okay. So let's try something called a class. So on the second h1, I'm going to give this a class. And we're going to call it second. Okay, so the class doesn't do anything other than specify, well, a class, which can be selected via CSS by using a dot. So I can be like dot second. And now this applies to dot second. This applies to anything that has a class of second. Now I put some curly brackets around it, and it's a style. And see, that has a specificity of 10. So every class gets you 10 points. So we'll say second color red. And the reason why those points matter is because technically this style and this style technically both apply to this element. So but you can't be red and blue. So one of these has to take priority. It's the one with the higher points. So see selector specificity, that one has 10 points. This one has 1 point, so it wins. Okay. Now, how can I get more points? Well, let's say I also included an ID. Okay. An ID, we'll call the ID blue. So maybe I only want to make that particular one blue. I can actually use multiple IDs, or I can use multiple selectors. So in this case, if I want to say an H1 with the ID of blue, a hash is the ID. So ID of blue. So see, now only this H1 is blue, and it overtakes the red. Because if I look at the specificity now, see, now we have an ID, because IDs are unique. Any HTML element can only have one ID. So that gets a higher score. So that gets 100 points. IDs get 100 points. So technically this is 101 points versus seconds 10 points. But this is more specific, so it doesn't apply to all H1s, only the H1 with the ID of blue. Okay? Nice. Now what if I made two of these? So let's make this selector again. And then I did this. I said this one is going to be more specific like this. What this means is H1s with the ID of blue that are a descendant of a tag called body. Okay, so this one has a score of 102 versus this one's score of 101. So if I make this green, that one wins. Okay, so that's why it's important to kind of like be aware of this whole CSS specificity deal, because how do you know which styles are going to take priority? It's always going to be higher score always wins, but if they have the same score, so if I did this, I took out the body, now they have the same score, it's the same style. Okay, or if I did this, actually, let's take the H1 out by say body blue. Okay, so this one should have 101. This has 101, but technically this still works because it's an H1 that has the ID of body. Doesn't matter that it's an H1. It's something that has the ID of blue, that it's a descendant of the body tag. Because if I go back to my HTML, see where's the H1? Inside of the body tag. So we got 1 point from using the body, and then 100 points from the ID. So even though these two selectors are quite different, this one still takes priority. And it takes priority because it's after the first one. So they both had the same score. So then the one that's written last wins. So because basically the code is read from top to bottom, so when one overrides another, it just overrides another. So that's kind of important to kind of understand sort of like which styles will overtake. Now, what's the simplest way to kind of avoid this whole mess? Only use classes. Oftentimes that's just sort of the best solution. Okay, because then everything has 10 points. So then you don't have to, all you have to do focus on is, does it point to the thing that I need? And just make sure the things that you need have the classes you want. Okay, and you can avoid this whole CSS selector mess. Okay, but let's just kind of finish going through the different types of selectors just to make this like clear. Okay, now let's say here, let's say inside this H1 I have another H1. Okay, cool, and that says cheese. Okay, let me see if I change this to no longer need this ID. All I want I want any H1 that's inside the body to be green. Okay, all of them are green except this one, because again the ID is 100 points, so that one's gonna win for that one. Okay, so let me just get rid of that for a second. Comment that out. Oh, and then that's also a winner, because this is going to only be 2 points because it's just 2 tags. So let me get rid of this one. See, they're all green, because even though cheese is not a descendant, it's not a child of body. Technically, cheese is an H1 that's a child of an H1 that is a child of body. Let's go back to the HTML so you can see that. So inside body, there's the H1 that says hello world, and inside this H1 here that says hello world, the H1 that says cheese is inside of that. So it's a child, but it still gets applied. So what if I only want these H1s that are direct children of body to get the style? Then what I can do is use this arrow. That will specify only the direct children. So the cheese should change color. Refresh. It did not like that. ¿Por qué? Okay. Let's see here. And let's see if I do this body. Body H1 color red. Is this running? Body. Oh no, I see. Right, no. Body, then an H1. Yeah, technically that other one shouldn't. Cheese shouldn't. But I think it's inheriting the style. I think that's the issue. Let's see if I make this a H3. Okay, so there, but I wouldn't apply anyways. Let's try this. Well, typically this means direct children versus this just means any descendant at any level, even though that's not quite working the way I'd expect it to at the moment. Okay, cool. But just to kind of focus on what we're doing, now let's take a look at form elements. You can also grab elements by their attributes. So let's say I want to style this input. So input of type equals text. Okay, so there's the input, and I want to style it. I could just select input, but oftentimes you might have different inputs and you want to style like the input boxes, like that are text type, different than the number types, different than the submit button. So what you can do is I could just target the attribute by itself, which you use square brackets for, and you just say type equals text, and this means, hey, I'm targeting anything that a element that has a type equals text attribute. Okay, and now I can say, hey, background color black. Color, the font color is white. Okay. There you go. Now see how it's like all nestled up against the corner? Maybe we want to give it some space, so we'll add some margin to it. So margin 10 pixels. Okay. Oh, then I forgot a colon. And see, that kind of gave it a little bit more space. Now we want some space inside the box because see the letters are all scrunched up against the edge of the box. So I'll do padding. I'll give that like 10 pixels. Okay, so that's nice. Let's make the font a little bit bigger. Font size, say 30 pixels. Okay, there we go. Look at that. That's starting to look like a nice form. Okay, and see, I was able to grab it just based on its attribute. And it doesn't have to be an existing attribute. You can make up attributes. So let's say I were to go back to that index.html. Now we're just to make up something. Say cheese equals Gouda. Okay, that attribute doesn't exist in HTML. Okay, I can still select it based on that. So I would just change this to cheese equals Gouda. Okay, let me just refresh this. And see, the style still applies. Okay, so you can do that. That's pretty neat. Font size, and let's say we want to round those corners, we'd use like border radius, which helps us round the corners. So we'll say we'll round the corners by like 30 pixels. And see, now you get a nice little round input box. See, that looks a lot nicer. So you can style a bunch of stuff. Okay, so that's like selectors. And again, attributes, like classes, get 10 points. Okay, so attributes and classes get 10 points. The tag name itself gets 1 point, and IDs get 100 points. There's more, but I think that's a pretty good place to start. And honestly, the easiest thing to do is just give everything a class. So that way everything is 10 points. It just simplifies having to think through like what the priority is. Okay, what a lot of people will do is they'll just use a naming convention like what's called BEM, block element modifier. So what they'll do is do something like this. Like let's say I have my header here. I'll give that a class of like header. And then let's say inside the header, I have an H1. I'll give that a class of like header title. Okay, and then so there we go. So any like, and now if I need to suddenly make a specific, let's say I have multiple header titles, right? Okay, so I have multiple header titles, but let's say I want this particular one to be green, then I would do is just add another class, header title, and then I would use 2 dashes to specify the modification. So green. Okay, and then these are my classes that I would use to target things. So basically I can be like, okay, well, I want all the headers. So the class header title, I want that class, I want them to all have like a font family. I will say Lucida Sans. I want them to all be like the same font. Cool. I want their color to be red. Well, actually, I want their color to be blue. That's fine. And I want their font size to be 3 EMs, which is going to be huge. Yeah. Okay. But only that one header title green. That one I want to be green. So I'm only modifying that one. That's why it's a modifier. Okay, and see that one. So all the header titles have the same style, but if only one has like one style different, then I'll use like a modifier class. Okay, this can look a little messy after a while, but it's a little bit more predictable. Like I can when you use that kind of naming convention, I can go here and I know, okay, this is like a title within like my header block. So I'm referring to that block of the header, like that chunk of my website. There's titles in that whatnot, then one of those titles is going to be green. This way everything is 10 points. Your classes read really clear as to what they're doing. Overall, it's just going to be easy to go back and read your styles later on. That's one possible naming convention. There are others. You can develop your own, but the idea is you want to have some sort of system. A couple other selectors to be aware of is the all selector. This selects everything. Okay, this selects absolutely everything. Oh no. Really? I've been talking to myself for the last 20 minutes.
Well, you didn't record it?
¿Por qué, María? ¿Por qué? Unless I guess it was a good dry run. Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com, and this is going to be my CSS or intro to CSS Masterclass. So this is mainly to be sort of a strong foundation in CSS, not every little thing about CSS ever, but enough to get you started. And if you haven't watched my intro to HTML Masterclass video, I recommend watching that, because I'm not going to re-explain like how to connect the CSS file to an HTML file or re-explain like a lot of HTML. It's going to be assumed that you at least kind of have a foundation in HTML at this point. Okay, but just to kind of recap, like HTML is a sort of so JavaScript, Python, Ruby, these are general purposes languages. They can be used for many purposes. HTML and CSS are very domain specific languages. Maybe that's probably not the exact right term that I want to use, but the idea is that they're a language for a very specific use. So HTML describes the content on a website, like what's there and where are they relative to each other, but not necessarily in space, like stylistically, but like structurally. And then CSS basically describes how that data should look like. How does that structure appear in the browser? So again, anything that's visual in an HTML file is in the body. So if I were to create an h1 tag and say hello, this describes the content that's going to appear on the screen. But to describe how that's going to look like, so I don't want it to necessarily be black on a white screen, maybe, I need to use a CSS file which is linked to that via this link tag. And here I'm linking a style.css. I've opened up this index.html with live server, so if you probably saw me do that in the HTML video. Okay. So with that, I can select elements. And a very important aspect of CSS is understanding what's called specificity. So I can select which element I want to style different ways. I could select an individual element. So I'm going to say, hey, I want to style that H1 there. Okay, and I'm going to say that H1 is going to be green. But I'm not selecting that H1. I'm selecting all H1s. So if I were to create multiples of these, H1, 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 okay, they're all going to be green. So what if I want to select specifically this one or specifically that one? Then you're going to need something else to help select it. So that could either be an ID. So we can say an ID of red. It could be a class. We'll say equals blue. Or it could be an attribute. Okay, and here you can make up anything you want. So we'll just call this cheese equals yellow. Okay, and I can actually use that as a way to specify that I want to style those specific ones. So let's do one at a time. Okay, so let me just close this app.js, go to style, let's close that too. So let's say I want to style based on class. Well, the class we had was called, blue. So it would be a dot blue. That means I'm targeting an element that has the class of blue. So then I go, okay, color blue. Okay, but wait a second. Doesn't H1 still apply to all H1s? So how did it know to prioritize the blue over the green? Well, every selector has a different specificity, a different score. So if I hover over the H1, I can see that its specificity is 1 point. So anytime you use just like an HTML element, like input, H1, main, div, that's always going to be 1 point. When you use a class, that's 10 points. Okay. So now let's try the ID. So an ID always starts with a hash. Now the ID we had was red. So I'm going to say red. That means I'm targeting an element with an ID of red. So we'll say color red. Okay, and see that one becomes red because that's the one I targeted. And see, let's see the specificity of an ID. IDs are unique. So again, you only can put the same ID on one element at a time. Well, classes can be reused over and over again. So IDs have a higher specificity score. They're actually worth 100 points. Okay. And the reason why that matters, again, is so that way you can understand like what styles have priorities over others. And then the last one, attributes, we would use the square brackets, and I would say cheese equals yellow. Okay, and that's my selector. And that selects any element that has that attribute. Okay, and we'll say that one is going to be color yellow. And see, that one becomes yellow. Okay, and then attributes also have a specificity of 10. There's a lot of other CSS selectors, pseudo selectors, pseudo elements. There's a whole world to CSS. Again, this is only an introduction. The main thing is learning how to select the thing. So we've learned 4 ways to select elements. We've learned their specificity. Cool. Now, my advice is, again, this is a matter of opinion, is to generally just use classes. This way, everything always just generally has a specificity of 10, so you don't have to worry about like clashes. And then use some sort of naming convention. One popular naming convention is BEM. Let's show you an example. Let's say we have a block of our website called a header. In that header, we have an h1. And then in there we have like a paragraph text. Some paragraph text that has some like lorem ipsum text. Lorem. There we go. So how would I do this? So what I would do is I'd first create a class for the block. So the block is header. So I could just target the header tag, but again, I want classes for everything, so that way everything has 10 points. And then the h1, I would do class equals header title, because it's in the header block, but it's the title element. It's a title in the header block. Okay, and then we'll just say class equals header content. Okay, so these are called, this is referred to as BEM, or block element modifier. So this is the block header, and see each class starts with header. This is the element. So in the header block, there's an element we're going to call title. And then let's say I have multiple titles. So let's say I have like 2 titles. But I want one of them to be green. Well, then in that case, I still want everything that's the same between the two to be in header title, but I'll create another class called header title green, meaning I'm modifying a title element within the header block. Okay, and it can seem like I'm typing up a lot and look a little messy because you're seeing a lot of classes, but what's going to happen is that, one, you're not going to run into like clashes of specificity. You are going to know exactly what these classes mean. I know, okay, which block, where in my code I need to find, where in my HTML should I find the element that I'm targeting, what part of that block am I targeting, and am I making any kind of modification to it? Like, it's just going to make it easier to read. This is not the only naming convention that's out there. It's a popular one. It's again referred to as BEM, block element modifier. But let's see how I would kind of use that. So I'd say, like, you know, I would say, hey, the header. Well, no, that's the tag. So the header block, we'll say I want that to be width of 80%. So I only want it to take up 80% of the width of the screen. Okay, and I want it to have a background color of black with a color of the font of white. Okay, so that's cool. Now notice a couple of things. One, this is not centered. So how can I center that? We can use margin. So if I set margin to auto on any kind of block level element, it'll center it. Okay, so that centers the block. And now notice, like, the text is kind of really kind of tight. I want the text to be a little, have a little padding away from the edges. So I'll give it padding. Padding 10 pixels. Okay, now notice, like, it's still like touching the very edge of the top of the screen. I kind of want to give like a little cushion there that's called margin. So maybe I want to give this some extra margin and say like 10 pix auto. Let's make it 30 pix auto. Okay, because see, the first number represents up and down, and then this number is the left and right margin, which if it's auto will automatically center it. Okay, there's a couple different ways you can kind of do that. Cool, so that's like the header, but now there's the title that's inside of there, which right now is, I'm assuming is, do I actually have anything in the title? That's why. So title 1, title 2. Okay. So now let's like style those titles. So again, dot header underscore underscore title. So I style that class, and we'll just say, hey, font family. That's the font. We'll say it's Lucida Sans. And see, now they both have a changed font, but I only want one of them to be green. So I'll say dot header title dash dash green. That's the modifier. And I'll say, hey, for that one, I want the color to be green. Okay, that's pretty cool. Now, a couple other things to be aware of is that there's an all selector. So this selector here selects all elements, all of them. What I like to do, again, it's going to be more like personal style. What I like to do is I like to get rid of all the default. This is what's referred to as a reset. You're getting rid of all the default sort of stylings. There are special CSS files that do a full reset. They reset every style, so that way you don't have to worry about any browser defaults. Because what happens is that every browser has different defaults. So if you leave them there, your styling may look a little bit different in a different browser. So people just like to reset it to like nothing. I do a little bit of a basic reset. So I'll zero out the padding. I'll zero out the margin. And I like to change what's called the box sizing and change that to border box. Because see, by default what happens is that the padding and margin, when you specify more padding and margin, it gets added to the width or the height, the width or height of the box. But when you do border box, any margin or padding you specify is included in the size of the box. Okay, it doesn't add, it includes. So that's what that does. Okay, so that way if it's a 100 pixel box, you say, hey, I want 100 pixels of height, and then you add 10 pixels of padding. You're taking 20 pixels out of that box that already exists. You're not adding another 20 pixels to it. Cool. Now you can also use your dev tools that kind of help you kind of see what CSS things have. So if you click on elements here, so let me make this bigger. You see this thing over here. I can highlight any element and I can see which styles apply to it. And if for some reason a style is being overridden, so I can see here like these two styles are being overridden in this case because something else is specifying it that has a higher priority, I can see that. Okay, so this allows me to kind of like see what's going on and which is prioritizing, like the dimensions of the box. So where's the border, where's the padding, you know, where's the box. Again, this is the padding. Padding's always on the inside of the box, border's on the edge of the box, and then margins, that's area around the box. Okay, so this gives you an idea of what's causing the size of the box. So that's a lot of pretty useful there. So make sure you can make use of that. You can again just select the element in here and then see the specific styles that apply to it. There's also another cool feature called it's called Css Custom Properties, but at the end of the day, it's variables. And what you do is you use this root selector. The root selector really doesn't actually specify anything. But it's really used for like defining variables. So the way you would do that is you would say dash dash and a name for your variable. So we'll say color. And then you just specify the value of that variable. It could be like a font size, could be a type of font, it could be anything. Okay, so I'm saying, hey, this variable equals, so the variable color equals red. So now if I go over here and let's say instead of background color black, to use the variable I would type in var parentheses and then I do dash dash color. And now I'm using that variable. The cool thing about this is that if I use variables throughout all my styles, if I need to change a bunch of different styles, I don't have to go rewrite the color in a bunch of different styles. I can just change here. So I can just change this back to black and it changes it. Okay, so if I had multiple things that were using that color, I can just change them in one place instead of changing them in a lot of places, which is pretty nice. A couple last, also you can animate things and use Pseudo Selector. So let's do that real quick. So here's the title, so these H1s. What I'm going to do is I'm going to make it do a dot header title hover. So this hover is what's called a pseudo selector. So I'm still selecting the same element, but I'm selecting it in a particular state when I hover over it. Okay, so I'm going to modify it, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to say when it hovers, the font size will become 3 EMs. Okay, EMs are like a relative size, so like pixels are like a hard number. EMs and percentages are relative to certain things. But if I do this now, when I hover over these H1s, they should get bigger. See, they get bigger. But notice it's kind of like an abrupt change. Okay, so what I can do is I can actually have that animate. So the way I can do that is that in the non-hover version of the element, I can do what's called an animation. Or actually, I want to do a transition. And then I can specify what do I want the transition. I want the font size to transition. and I want it to transition in like half a second. Okay. So now it should transition a little bit slower. Maybe not font size, might not be a good transition. Let's try it with like a color. Let's change this to color. Oh, also I spelled transition wrong. That would probably cause a problem. So let's try that again. Yep, there we go. See, that's a much. See how that's a much smoother look. So you can create transitions, and I can make it really slow. So I can make it like 3 seconds. Then it's like takes a really long time. Not quite as smooth. Okay. And you can transition many properties. So if I want to add another property, if I also want to do color, and let's say I want to do color for like 2 seconds. Okay, and then we'll change the color to pink. So then it goes, slowly changes to pink. Slowly changes to pink. Okay. So you can do something like that. That's kind of fun. You can also do like an animation. Okay. So I can do something like this, like animation. And I need to call it cheese. And we'll do it for like 2 seconds. Now we need to define that animation. So I'm going to say like at keyframes cheese. And then we're going to say like at 10%, and you have to do this by percentages. So at 10% of the time, what I want to do is color red. So I'm going to get rid of the, did I get rid of the transition? Yeah, I'll get rid of the transition. And get rid of the color here. Because I want to do this kind of a rainbow effect. 20%. So at 20% of the time, I want the color to be blue. I just keep doing this. 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90. So 30 yellow. And just so you kind of see it's working, let me just like hover over this and see it starts like changing colors. Because what I'm doing, I'm saying at 10% of the time that I specified 2 seconds. At 10% of 2 seconds, turn red, then 20% turn blue, then 30% turn yellow, then we'll say orange, then we'll say green, then we'll say magenta, and we'll say medium sea green, then we'll say brown, and then I gotta change all these numbers. 30, that's gonna be 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, then at 100% and at purple. So now when I hover, it's going to run that animation. Very nice. And you can change anything in here. I can change size. So I can say, hey, like at 50%, font size, we'll go to 3 EMs. Actually, I gotta put a semicolon there first. Just make it 5 EMs. Kind of a odd effect, but the idea is you can play with all sorts of really cool animations. So there's a lot of cool stuff you can do with CSS. You can style anything, you can animate things, create transitions. It's all a matter of practice and just kind of like, getting used to all these properties. But this should give you a good exposure to the kind of things you can do from your CSS file to make your site pretty cool. And there's lots and lots, there's hundreds of CSS properties that you can apply to any of these selectors. There's also things like Flexbox and Grid, which I have videos on, so I recommend watching those. But hopefully this helps you get situated. I'll see you all later.